Nobody in Millbrook Falls believed Daniel Carter had ever held more than $100 in his life, and that single wrong belief was about to blow their small town apart. If you have ever been judged for how you look instead of who you are, stay with me until the very end of this story, because what this quiet single father did with $10 million will change the way you see every poor stranger you pass on the street. Before we go further, if stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe, because this one is going to stay with you long after the video ends. Daniel was 38 years old, and every single morning at 5:45, he pulled on the same faded navy jacket, the one with a small tear at the left elbow that he had mended himself with mismatched thread, and he laced up boots that had been resoled twice. He lived with his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, in a narrow rented house at the edge of town, the kind of house with a porch step that creaked no matter how carefully you stepped on it. The neighbors saw a tired man who worked long hours as a maintenance handyman at the old community center, a man who packed his daughter's lunch in a reused paper bag, a man who never once complained, and never once explained himself either. What nobody knew, what nobody could have possibly guessed, was that Daniel had once built and sold a small logistics software company for an amount of money that would have changed the entire town's opinion of him in a single sentence. He had walked away from that world on purpose. He had watched money turn people he loved into strangers, watched it turn friendships into transactions, and after his wife passed away when Lily was barely 2, he made a decision that most people would call insane. He decided his daughter would never know a childhood built on comfort bought instead of earned. He wanted her to know kindness before she ever knew currency. So he moved to Millbrook Falls, rented a small house under a name that meant nothing to anyone, and let the town believe exactly what it wanted to believe. The judgment came fast, and it came often. At the school gates, mothers in clean coats would glance at Lily's hand-me-down shoes and whisper just loud enough to be heard. At the grocery store, the cashier would count his crumpled bills with a small, pitying smile, as if she were doing him a personal favor by not commenting. The town's wealthiest family, the Hendersons, who owned 3 car dealerships and sat on every charity board that mattered, treated Daniel the way people treat furniture, present, but unworthy of real attention. Mrs. Henderson once told her daughter, in front of Lily, not to invite that girl to her birthday party because some families just don't belong at the same table. Lily came home that day and asked her father why some people had big houses and she didn't. Daniel knelt down, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and told her that a house does not measure a heart, and one day she would understand exactly what he meant. He did not tell her the rest. He could not yet. Lily's classmates were not the only ones who drew lines around the Carters. At the annual town fair, families set up folding tables along Main Street selling pies and raffle tickets, and every year Daniel brought Lily to walk the length of it holding $2 in quarters, enough for 1 game and 1 lemonade, nothing more. He watched other fathers slide crisp 20s across tables without a second thought, watched their children carry home stuffed bears twice the size of Lily's, and he never once reached for his phone to check the balance that could have bought the entire fair twice over. It cost him something every single time, a small private ache he never let show on his face, because he had made a promise to himself the day his wife died that Lily would learn to want things and wait for them, to feel the shape of an actual dollar in her palm, before she ever understood what 1,000,000 of them looked like on a screen. For 5 years Daniel lived this way, working with his hands, fixing leaking pipes and broken heaters for people who barely looked him in the eye, driving an old pickup truck with a dent in the door that he refused to fix because fixing it felt like betraying the story he had built. Every night after Lily fell asleep clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear worn thin from love, Daniel would sit at the kitchen table with his laptop and quietly manage the fortune nobody knew existed. He donated anonymously to causes across the country, careful never to let a single dollar trace back to Millbrook Falls, careful never to let his daughter's world collide with the world he had walked away from. He told himself this was enough. He told himself invisible generosity was still generosity. But something was building in him, a pressure he could not name. Every time he watched his own town struggle while he sat on more money than most of its residents would see in 10 lifetimes combined. Then came the flood. It rained for 4 days straight, a rain that did not feel like weather but like punishment. And on the fifth night, the river that ran behind Main Street rose higher than anyone alive could remember. The water swallowed the elementary school where Lily took her reading lessons. It swallowed the small clinic that served half the county. It swallowed the food pantry that 100 families depended on every single week. By morning, Millbrook Falls was not a town anymore. It was a photograph of loss, boats floating past rooftops, families huddled in the high school gymnasium on donated cots, children crying for toys that were now somewhere underwater. The Hendersons, the family with 3 dealerships and every charity board seat, wrote a check for $2,000, made sure the local newspaper photographed them handing it over, and then quietly stopped answering calls from the recovery committee. Daniel stood in that gymnasium holding Lily's hand, watching Mrs. Delgado, the school nurse, try to comfort a boy who had lost his family's entire home, watching Mr. Ibarra, who ran the tiny hardware store, weep silently into a donated blanket because 40 years of inventory was gone in a single night, watching his daughter's own teacher, Ms. Whitfield, hand out the last of the bottled water with hands that shook from exhaustion. Something in Daniel finally broke, not from grief, but from clarity. He looked around that gymnasium and understood, with total certainty, that the mask he had worn for 5 years had a price, and that price was other people's suffering while he stayed comfortable in his own secret. That night, he did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table long after Lily had drifted off in a cot beside him, because their own rented house had flooded too, and he opened his laptop one final time, not to donate quietly and disappear, but to do something he had sworn he would never do again. He called his old attorney, a woman named Patricia Nolan, who had handled the sale of his company years earlier and who was one of only 3 people alive who knew who Daniel Carter really was. His voice was steady when he told her what he wanted. $10 million, transferred immediately, publicly, attached to his real name, directed entirely toward rebuilding Millbrook Falls, the school, the clinic, the food pantry, and a permanent flood relief fund that would outlast the news cycle by decades. Patricia was quiet for a long moment before she asked him if he was certain, because once his name was attached, there would be no more hiding. Not for him. Not for Lily. Daniel looked across the gymnasium floor at his daughter's face, lit only by emergency lighting, and told Patricia that hiding had never once made his daughter braver. But maybe this would. 3 days later, the town called an emergency meeting at the high school gym, the only building large enough and dry enough to hold everyone. The mayor stood at a folding table with a microphone that kept cutting out, trying to explain that an anonymous, and then suddenly no longer anonymous, donation of $10 million had been wired into the town's recovery account that morning. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People turned to each other, whispering names, guessing at which distant millionaire or corporation might have taken pity on their broken town. Nobody, not a single person in that room, guessed the name that was about to be read aloud. The mayor cleared his throat and read the donor's name from the paper in his shaking hands. Daniel Carter. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then every head in that gymnasium turned, slowly, disbelieving, toward the man standing near the back wall in a faded navy jacket, holding his daughter's hand exactly the way he had held it every single day for 5 years. Mrs. Henderson's mouth actually fell open. The cashier, who used to count his crumpled bills with pity, pressed a hand to her chest. Ms. Whitfield, Lily's teacher, had tears sliding down her face before she even understood why. Someone near the front whispered, "The maintenance guy?" loud enough for it to echo, and the words hung in the air like an accusation the whole town suddenly owed itself. Daniel did not smile in triumph. He did not step forward to bask in anything. He simply walked to the front of that gymnasium, knelt slightly so the old microphone could catch his voice, and told them the truth, all of it, without a single word wasted on justifying the 5 years of silence. He told them about his late wife, about wanting his daughter to grow up understanding people before she understood money, about the software company he had built and sold, about the quiet donations he had sent to strangers in other towns, while his own neighbors struggled without knowing he could have helped sooner. He told them he was not sorry for hiding who he was, because it had let him see Millbrook Falls exactly as it truly was, both its cruelty and its courage. but he was sorry it took a flood for him to finally use what he had for the people standing right in front of him. The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the room, and then, slowly, the applause began, hesitant at first, then rolling through the gymnasium like the very floodwater that had brought them all together in grief. Mr. Ibarra, who had lost 40 years of inventory, was the first to cross the room and shake Daniel's hand, his eyes wet, saying only that he always knew there was something different about the way Daniel fixed things, gentle, careful, like he cared more than the job required. Ms. Whitfield knelt down in front of Lily and told her, voice cracking, that her father was the bravest man she had ever met, not because of the money, but because of the 5 years he spent choosing kindness when nobody was watching and nobody would ever know. Mrs. Henderson approached last, her expression unreadable, and for a moment the whole room seemed to hold its breath, remembering her words about certain families not belonging at certain tables. She looked at Daniel for a long time, then at Lily, and something in her seemed to crack open. She apologized, quietly, imperfectly, the kind of apology that comes from a person confronting themselves for the very first time, and asked if her foundation could help fund the school rebuild alongside his contribution. Daniel did not gloat. He simply nodded and told her the town needed every hand it could get, and that the size of a person's bank account was never as important as the size of what they were finally willing to do with it. Not everyone in town changed their opinion overnight, and Daniel never expected them to. There were still a few who muttered that he had made fools of them on purpose, that 5 years of silence was its own kind of arrogance dressed up as humility. Daniel heard those whispers too, carried on the same wind as the earlier ones, and he chose not to defend himself against them, because he understood that trust rebuilt slowly looks a lot like the flood damage around him. Patient work, one plank and one nail at a time, with no shortcuts that actually held. What mattered more to him than being forgiven by everyone was watching the committee meetings fill with people who used to avoid eye contact with him, now leaning across folding tables to ask his opinion on where a support beam should go, or how deep a foundation needed to be poured to survive the next flood the river might send their way. In the months that followed, Millbrook Falls rebuilt itself piece by piece, the elementary school rising with a new wing named quietly, at Daniel's insistence, not after himself, but after every family who lost everything in the flood. The clinic reopened with equipment that saved 3 lives in its very first month. The food pantry expanded into a building twice its former size, staffed partly by volunteers who had once looked past Daniel in the grocery store line without a second glance. Daniel kept working with his hands, because he genuinely loved fixing things that were broken, but now he did it alongside neighbors who finally understood that the quiet man in the faded jacket had never needed their approval, only their honesty. Lily grew up in that town differently than either of them expected, not spoiled by sudden wealth, because Daniel made sure of that, but seen, truly seen, by people who had once looked past her shoes and never noticed her eyes. Years later, when she was old enough to understand every part of the story, she asked her father why he waited so long, why he let people believe he was poor when one phone call could have changed everything so much sooner. Daniel thought about it for a long moment before answering, the way he always did when a question actually mattered. He told her that money can rebuild a school in a matter of months, but it can never build character in a single afternoon, and he had wanted her, more than anything else in this world, to learn the difference between the two before life ever handed her the choice of which one to lead with. Lily never forgot that answer, and neither did the town that had once looked at her father and seen nothing worth noticing at all. If this story reminded you that true wealth is never about what you own, but about what you're willing to give when nobody is watching, share it with someone who needs that reminder today. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that prove kindness is still the richest thing any of us can offer the world.